Hello everyone, it's Christopher Johnson again, and I'm here to give a brief presentation on my position paper in the area of soteriology with the special issue of predestination and double predestination. So I trust you have the handout before you, and that's what I'll be going through now. The first topic here is an introduction to the issue of this soteriological idea. What is predestination and double predestination? I've given a very generalized definition with no specifics. I've painted with a broad brush, so to speak. So I have defined predestination as the idea that the Bible teaches that God has eternally elected certain individuals to salvation, while double predestination is the idea that the Bible teaches that God has eternally elected other individuals to condemnation. Again, that's a very generic definition, and there are certainly other definitions out there. So if you take issue with that one, just know that I'm not saying that's the only one or the correct one for that matter. So its relation to soteriology. How does it relate? Well, this relates to the doctrine of soteriology because it touches on the very means by which a person attains to or does not attain to salvation. So we're talking about who does the work and who's responsible. Is there one party? Is there more than one party? Is it God alone? Is it God and the cooperation of man? And so that's kind of where we're at on the weightiness of that. So what does the Bible say about the doctrine of predestination or election? And I'm using the terms synonymously here, the terms predestination and election. The Bible is very specific, I believe, with regards to God choosing certain individuals or certain peoples for himself. I think we see that in the text of both the Old Testament and New Testament. Now, if someone were to take variations on the words destined, predestined, elect, foreknew, or the word choose, that person is going to populate scores of results in the search engine. Now, I will say that not all of those pertain to these doctrines, maybe not even half of them, but definitely some of them are within the context and speak to this doctrine of predestination and election. So I think that validates that the Bible has spoken. And remember, we only need the Bible to speak one time for it to be true, but oftentimes God at least gives us a double witness, and that is certainly the case with this doctrine. Next is the weight of foreknowledge. Now, foreknowledge is going to be foreknowledge that God has. It is knowledge of the future and of what he knows beforehand, before something takes place. And I've titled this The Weight of Foreknowledge because it is a person's understanding of what this means that really paints the lens, or colors the lens rather, of the glasses that they will then see the rest of this doctrine. And then, as we know, all the doctrines touch each other at some point somewhere in the Bible. So it could actually, how a person views foreknowledge or this doctrine skews how a person sees everything in the Bible. And this idea of foreknowledge is hotly debated, and people argue as to whether or not, depending on the definition that you hold, certain definitions people would argue that it violates man's free will, namely the Reformed position. And they would see the Reformed position as God dragging man against his will, kicking and screaming, and God dragging him into heaven. And by the same token, the idea of double predestination, it would be the idea of God denying all men an equal opportunity or a fair and equal shake at acceptance of Jesus as Lord and Savior. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not that's an accurate assessment of it or not, but again, that's just a broad brush of an idea of that. So next, moving to Pauline usage, Paul is arguably the Reformed views go-to apostle and texts or books of the Bible to validate this doctrine. In other words, Paul does a lot of the heavy lifting for us in that respect. And the Apostle Paul wages a very convincing argument for the doctrine of election in Romans 9 through 11. In those chapters, the non-Reformed view would see Paul's arguments being in support of God electing ethnic Israel, as opposed to arguing for this idea that that God saves man without man's cooperation. While the Reformed view would see this argument as God electing individuals whom God chooses out of the secret counsel of his own doing and for reasons not necessarily known to man, but it brings God pleasure in the way that he has chose to choose people or not choose people. Now I'd like to back up just a second. I forgot to address something with the idea of foreknowledge. Before Paul gets to the theological arguments in 9 through 11, we have chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we see what is called the golden chain of salvation or the golden chain of redemption. And this is basically the idea of, well, we believe it to be the process of salvation spelled out for us in the biblical text. Or in other words, step one of salvation and then the steps that follow after that. This is known by the Latin term ordo salutis, which just means order of salvation. And in chapter 8, Paul writes, those who God foreknew, he predestined. Those who God predestined, and then so on and so forth. And he gives several verbs as to what the process of salvation is. Well, we see that foreknowledge is the at the head of this process. And so that's why I entitled that, another reason, the weight of foreknowledge, because how one understands that idea or how they define that, again, excuse the rest of their understanding, for better or for worse, what that means. So that's Paul's usage of it. Now, other biblical usage, to give other witnesses, would be, I'll name one, the Old Testament. We know from reading the Old Testament that God has given the nations of the people over to their sinful ways, their wickedness, you could say, given them over to Satan and left them in their sin, so to speak. But out of all the nations of the world, then God comes back, and through Abraham, he decides to choose a people group for himself. And so here we have this idea of God having before him a group of people, and out of that group of people, he decides to choose only some of all. And so I would argue this is a witness to the truth that God does in fact choose people out of his own counsel and for his own reasons. Next is objections to the idea or the doctrine of election. Probably the biggest objection to predestination is around the manner in which God chooses those who are elect. And this idea goes back to foreknowledge, God having knowledge of things that happen beforehand. And I've asked myself this, and I would ask each of you to ask yourselves this question and contemplate it and seek a biblical answer for it. And that is, and I call this the $10 million question, because I believe we all agree that God knows the future. But, and here's the question, how does God know the future? How does God know what he knows? Is it because he can look down the halls of time and see every possible scenario of every situation, every nuance and dynamic, and know exactly what's going to happen? And so he looks down the halls of time. He sees those who will accept his gospel message at some point or another, and those who he sees will accept it. He foreknows that, and so then he predestines them, and then he justifies them, and so on and so forth. That's typically a non-reformed view. And for me, I think it makes God look kind of like the supercomputer who is somewhat cold and calculating, in that not only that, but I think it gives man a reason to boast somewhat, because God is, in essence, electing those or predestining those who have made a decision for him. Now, I know a lot of people disagree with this, and I know it's a very divisive doctrine, but I don't hold that view. Rather, I would hold the view that God knows everything that is going to happen because he decrees it to happen. Now, I do not for a second think that makes men robots, and that God ordains every minutia of every little thing that a man does. For instance, did I wake up this morning and God ordained that I would wear this shirt or the socks I have on? I don't believe that, but I don't have time to discuss that now in this paper or in this class probably. But so I gave at least one objection to election, and then a rebuttal to that, if you will. But I don't believe God coerces anybody to do anything, and he completely preserves man's free will, even though I believe it's God who monergistically and does the work alone. And that's what the word monergistic means. It means one work. I don't believe man plays any role in that. I believe man has lost the ability, and so God gives man the ability. Now, the idea of double predestination. Most who acknowledge this doctrine of double predestination also see single predestination differently than mentioned above. I'm not sure if that made sense as I just read that. So when we look at the idea of single predestination, those who hold that there would be then a double predestination see it being worked out in the exact same way as single predestination is. And I kind of just addressed that in my rebuttal. The Reformed view does not see that okay, so in single predestination, God is doing the work. He has decreed that man will come to salvation, and then God ensures that happens by giving man an irresistible grace and the ability to accept Christ. Double predestination is seen as God just kind of on the flip side doing the opposite of that. And what he does is he works in a man's life in a way that causes man to sin and causes man to stay condemned in that state of sin, and God doesn't give that person a chance towards salvation at all. And I would reject that definition of predestination. The Reformed view is that God sees that we see God working in a man's life to make salvation happen, but double predestination is God is not working that out, but he simply passes man over and leaves him to his sinful ways. Nobody receives injustice in that scenario. The person who is left to their own sin receives justice, not injustice, because remember, we're all born into sin. The person who is elect does not receive injustice because he should have received the same justice that the sinner, the other sinner who was passed over did, but God gives mercy, and mercy and justice are never outside the character of God. So nobody receives injustice in either of those scenarios. So in conclusion, because I've already kind of given the Reformed view, that if you see that on the handout, I'll just skip to the conclusion. It can hardly be argued, in my opinion, that the concept of predestination is not taught in some fashion or form in the Bible. Now, we may argue over, maybe not argue, but we may discuss or go back and forth as to how it is taught and what it means. But I think we would all agree the words are there and they mean something, and they mean that there is a doctrine of this in the Bible. So the argument then really centers around the how and the why God chooses who he chooses, or who he doesn't choose, who he doesn't choose. That didn't make any sense. That was redundant, but you know what I'm talking about. I've said it enough times already. So, does God choose based on the knowledge of a man's future decision to accept the gospel? Or does God choose according to the secret counsel of his own will and for his own pleasures, and in a manner that is above the ways of man to understand? I know what my opinion is. I've shared that with you, and we all must come to our own conclusions prayerfully and through our exegesis of the text. So God bless you, and I'll see you next time.